Alright, so getting started, first thing I wanted to do was verify that the studs were behind where the drywall lined up, and pulling out the stud finder I couldn't find the studs on this wall. I ended up thinking maybe the batteries needed to be changed, so I changed them. But what I ended up finding out was that there's two layers on this wall. There's a plywood layer behind it, and I couldn't pick up where the studs were at. I could pick them up on the second wall, so I knew that the second wall was good. But what I ended up realizing was underneath there was a plywood layer. So I figured if I could find where the plywoods lined up together, that would be the stud, which is what you're seeing here. That was where the stud would be, and it didn't line up with where the drywall had overlapped. So I marked that and thought, okay, well, 8 feet from that should be the end of this plywood. So there's another overlap on this side. So 8 feet up, looking at that, underneath the plastic sheeting there, it's a little harder to tell on this side, but there was where the plywood had overlapped. So I knew, okay, that's where the studs will be. So this gave me the confidence to get going on the project. Really all I ended up doing was building boxes over and over. The first one took me the most time. I never built the box before. I never really had to square anything up, so I watched a lot of videos on how to do this project. Got the box built. The next day I started marking the wall. What I did was use spare pieces or scrap pieces of the 2x4s that I'd cut and stuck them into the studs, and I would use them as an extra set of hands. It was just me primarily working on this, so my first thought was I'll just stand it up, build the legs and stand it up. Looking back, I probably would have done this differently. Standing this thing up the way I did and by myself wasn't the safest. You can see I'm kind of straddling all over the place. I'm using other pieces of wood to help me hold it up. I also watched some videos where people had built, put the first 2x4 on the wall and then used pocket screws. I would probably do that if I was to do this again, because primarily standing this thing up wasn't the safest. Once I got it up, everything else really wasn't as difficult. This was probably the hardest thing of the project that I did. After I got the top shelf secured to the shorter wall, I started mounting it to the back wall. I utilized these clamps quite a bit throughout the whole project. These are one of the tools that I bought specifically for this that I didn't have. A couple clamps and then a larger level. One thing I would recommend is having a longer level than I had. I think with the length of these shelves, it would have been a better idea. Everything turned out okay, but looking back, I would probably recommend a longer level. I spent a lot of time going through and marking the walls. Here you see I'm putting the 4-inch screws through the studs. I ended up getting 4-inch screws because there's at least a 1/2-inch drywall, 1/2-inch plywood, the 1.5-inch 2x4s that I'm using. So I wanted to make sure I was able to get all the way through and get a good bite on the 2x4s on this wall in particular. The other walls, I had 3-inch screws that I used until I ran out. Once I ran out of the 4-inch screws, I used the 3-inch screws on the other walls. This is where I started to mess up a little bit. What I tend to do is get into a project and just want to go until I'm done. It was pretty late in the day at this point, and I hadn't taken a break or anything, but I kept building, and this box ended up not being square, so I had to redo it a couple times. So another thing I would recommend is take your time. a project like this, especially if you're new to it, there's no problem in going slow, and a lot slower than I did. I tried to get all this done as fast as possible. As far as tools, I did have quite a few things on hand. But I did end up buying a used circular saw and a new blade for that, and several other smaller items. But it didn't take a whole lot of tools to get this done, and it was an investment. A lot of these things I'll end up using long term. At this point, I remember looking at the project going, it's actually coming together. So that was pretty fun. One thing I did a lot of was verify that everything was level. I didn't want to have this thing come crashing down, or I didn't want it to look goofy from the street. So I made sure everything was level as I worked along. I did almost all of the cutting on the floor, which was pretty brutal on my knees. I think in the future I'll be getting a table so that I can cut the wood on the table, standing up. This section I did a little bit differently. I just tied the backboard to the 2x4s to the wall, the studs, and then I put the front on. After I did that, that was the last section. My wife came out, check on me, make sure everything's good. Took advantage of that and had her help me out for a sec and put some of the from the front board on before she boogied. There's a visible overlap where the two top shelves connect together. I wanted to cover those up, so I put a 2x4 across the front. This is the next day. The tops of the shelves are particle board. What I ended up doing was taking the measurements to Lowe's and buying the 4x8 sheets. I believe I needed 3 of them, and they just cut them down to size for me at the store, which made it really convenient for transportation. I just put them in the back of my Ford Focus, brought them back home, and then installation was pretty easy at that point. You just put them in place, and I put them down with 1-inch screws, 1-inch wood screws. One thing I did notice was if I torqued them too much, the particle board would want to split. This is my wife giving me her approval. She heads off for the day. I was really hoping to get all this completed by the time she got home, which I was able to do. Originally, I had this design so that I could stack in the black totes, but I didn't want to buy all brand new totes when we already had a lot of good ones. So what I ended up doing was, originally I started loading up the totes that were the same dimensions on the top and the second shelf, but then started to realize that I was going to run out of room. I had more stuff that needed to be stored on here than I'd realized. I did have a little bit of extra material, so with the extra material I took some of the yard items that we had that were always leaning up against the wall and made a hanger for them. Put them up on the wall, get some extra real estate. So this is me finding the studs, putting the 2x4 up, and then hanging everything on there, just putting screws in, some of the extra screws that I had to put everything on there and just let it hang. In the future, this will probably come down and I'll overhaul this piece of the garage. Long term, I'd like to get a toolbox or a tool area. I wanted to incorporate that into the shelving, but didn't realize how much we had that needed to be stored. So I had to kind of scrap that idea. There's a lot of tires and things that we have that I also need to build some extra storage for moving forward. The goal is to get everything off the floor as much as possible in the garage. Some of the future projects will be doing the garage floor with epoxy. Our backyard isn't finished, so I need to do the backyard and quite a few other things. So this is what we started out with, and and this is what we ended up with when it was all said and done. So this was the first stab at it. So I'd appreciate any suggestions or any comments that anyone has on how to improve my skills here. I'm really interested in building more around the house and appreciate your help.